Hi, today we're going to be looking at the subject of culture and leadership, which is an extremely important topic as the world becomes more and more globalized and we get more and more exposure to different cultures. Now, a lot of times when we think of culture, we just think of the different cultures that exist in the United States, but within the United States, the cultures are fairly homogenized. Everybody's kind of working towards adapting the national culture. And so, what we're going to do today is we're going to focus not on the different cultures in America, but the different cultures that exist around the world. Now, we're going to start off with five cross-cultural competencies that have been identified that are necessary for leaders to function in a multicultural and international setting in light of globalization. The first is we need to understand the business, the political, and the cultural environments of whatever relevant cultures that we're dealing with. When we look at America, we can say, yeah, it's tough enough to understand the business, political, and cultural environments that are going on here that we have to work in. But when you start working with another country, you add a whole nother layer of complexity onto these questions. Now, those are kind of the global, nationwide things. We also need to learn to adapt to individuals. We need to learn the perspectives, the taste, and the trends, the technologies that people use in the relevant cultures, which can be quite different than what we experience here in America. And then finally, thirdly, we need to be able to work with various people in different cultures and work simultaneously with different cultures. If perhaps you remember that I spent 17 years in France, and so I had to learn to work with French people. And French people have very different values than Americans. But I also worked with a lot of African immigrants. So I had to learn how to work with other Americans that were in my organization, had to learn with the French, had to learn to work with the Africans. Sometimes everybody was together, and it's a little tricky sometimes trying to balance everything out. A fourth characteristic is being able to adapt and live and communicate in other cultures, which is not too easy. Fortunately, English has become the international language, so most educated people in the rest of the world have studied English more than we have studied some other language. So international leaders tend to communicate in English. But if you really want to understand another culture, you have to speak the language. There's no way that you can get around understanding a culture without learning the language. And then a fifth competency that's important is to learn to relate to other cultures from a position of equality rather than superiority. It is so easy to think that our culture is the best. We do things the right way, everybody else does things the wrong way, or they'll catch up with us, or something like that. But that is not true. We're naturally culturally centered, egocentric in how we view cultures, and people from other cultures are like that too. They'll be tempted to complain that Americans don't do it the right way, or they do it in a really inferior way, things like that. But we need to learn to work with people, respecting their culture, learning from them, and not be so arrogant to think that our way of doing things is the best way. Now, what I want to do with the rest of the time here is to focus on a study called the Globe Study that looked at culture, leadership, and organizations throughout the world. There were 62 nations that were studied, and what House did and his colleagues, they measured beliefs and values of managers in these different countries. So we're dealing with pretty educated people here. It's not how people live in the different villages or how farmers function, things like that. We're talking about managers generally in large international companies. And one of the first things that he found as he started looking at the culture and how people led and the values was that there tends to be various groups that occur. And generally, the countries that are nearer to each other tend to function together. For example, one of the groups that he found was Latin America, and that would go all the way from Mexico down to Argentina and Chile. And they tend to have uh, similar culture. They're either Spanish or Portuguese um, uh, speaking. The they're attached to one another. They have a similar history, and so there's a lot of cultural similarities between them. Some other groups that he found were Nordic Europe. That means mainly the Scandinavian countries. Um, the one group that wasn't geographically together was the Anglo-American group, and that basically includes um, the UK and the former colonies that are primarily white now. So that includes Canada, USA, Australia, Ireland, England. Somehow South Africa got in there. And they used to be Dutch speaking, and the white population of South Africa, and then New Zealand. Even though, so these countries are spread out all over the world, but they tend to have a similar culture. Perhaps big factor of that has to do with um, television and history, and they since they all speak the same language, the communication goes passes very well. Germanic Europe was another category. Latin Europe, and that involves the countries with the Romance languages, the Latin-based languages like France and Portugal and Spain and Italy and French-speaking Switzerland. It's interesting. Israel came into that grouping too. And they have a lot of cultural similarities. Sub-Saharan Africa grouped together nicely. Now, if they had had lots more countries and a larger sample, Sub-Saharan Africa would have been broken up into different groups, but I think they only had a handful of countries and they all grouped together compared to the rest of the world. Eastern Europe grouped together, the Middle East, and then Confucian Asia or East Asia grouped together, and then Southern Asia um, grouped together also in terms of values and leadership. Now, one of the things that the Globe study did was they looked at as they looked at different values, they did a factor analysis to see what values went together. And they came up with 9 cultural dimensions, and you can read about all of them in the textbook or other studies. And I just want to go through a few of them to show how countries differ by culture. A big one, is uncertainty avoidance. And that's the idea of relying on social norms and the different ways of doing things and the procedures to avoid uncertainty. And some countries really want to avoid uncertainty, and some are quite tolerant of uncertainty. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow? An example would be Germanic Europe was pretty high was the highest in terms of uncertainty avoidance. Um, France, where we lived, was quite high in uncertainty avoidance. I was surprised by how much people were were really bothered by not knowing what the future was going to hold. The idea of taking risks was a lot more scary to the French than to Americans. An example of low would be Latin America, where people generally don't feel this need to know everything that's going to happen in the future. Another dimension is power distance, and that's the idea that, are different levels of powers good and normal and expected? And in some countries, yes, it's expected that the more educated, the elite people will have a higher authority, and that the simpler people will have less authority and power. So in China, you've got a big expectation of power distance. In Nordic Europe and the Scandinavian countries, everybody's put on the same level. The president and the worker, they can be friends if they want. It's very little, very a very small social distance between different levels of hierarchy. Um, Another example of a dimension is in-group collectivism, and that's the idea of expressing pride and loyalty and cohesiveness to their organizations and families. Are you going to try to treat everyone equal, or are you going to give special priority to your family, to your organization? Some cultures, it's really important to give priority to your family and to your organization. Um, so high would be like Confucian Asia, the Middle East. Low, the Anglo countries, like America. The idea of nepotism is a sin. Oh, you're going to specifically hire your relatives? No, you shouldn't do that. You should treat everybody equally in the Anglo-American culture. But not all cultures are like that. Another dimension is gender egalitarianism. The idea how big should the gender role differences be? In countries like Scandinavia, they're minimized. In the Middle East, some countries the women can't even drive cars. They're huge. So that's one of the things that defines the difference between how countries function. Another dimension would be performance orientation. This is kind of like the task orientation that we've seen in a lot of leadership uh, theories. In some countries, the idea of encouraging and rewarding people for improving or for getting the task done is really high. In the Anglo-American countries, accomplishing things, getting things done, getting them done on time is really important. An example where it's less important would be in the Latin America countries, where there isn't such a high emphasis on performance. Another dimension would be the humane orientation, and that's the idea of encouraging and rewarding people for being fair, altruistic, taking care of others, generous, being kind to other people. And this is similar to the relationship dimensions that we've seen. High is sub-Saharan Africa. I've worked with a lot of Africans, and the relationships are so important, and being kind and good to one another is absolutely essential. An example of where the relationships tend to be lower would be Latin Europe, where you can be really brusque with people, very forceful, and it can be a little intimidating to Americans to go to countries that are so direct and not so intent on being nice and polite to everyone. All right. Now, another thing that the Globe study did was that they identified different leadership behaviors that are considered important to various degrees in different cultures, and then they looked at the different groups of cultures and said which ones are more important. So the six sets of leadership behaviors that they found that they used that came out in the analysis were, first of all, so the charismatic, the value-based leadership, where the leader is motivating people towards a vision. There's the team-oriented behaviors, where everybody's trying to participate together in a team. There's participative leadership, where the leaders try to get other people's input before making decisions. Humane-oriented is relationship-oriented. Autonomous was a new dimension that they came up with, and that's kind of the idea that the leader that doesn't need anybody else, doesn't need to be told what to do by his superior, kind of like the Superman, able to do everything type leader. And then another characteristic was self and group protective leadership, leadership that's concerned about protecting themselves and the in group, uh, and protecting the team members from negative outside influences. And so for each of the clusters, I think there's 9 clusters of countries. We'll start off with the Anglo-American cluster. Some leadership behaviors are real valued. So in the American Anglo system, the charismatic value-based leadership is very valued. Um, Americans tend to like people that have this grand vision. We want to join in with them on uh, accomplishing the vision. Participative leadership is valued by Americans and other Anglos. This idea that leaders should get people involved in the decision making, and then the humane-oriented leadership, the importance of relationships, is also important to Americans compared to other uh, countries. Now, on the medium level, we've got the team-oriented leadership. We've got autonomous leadership. We don't really expect our leaders to be supermen. And then the self-protective leadership, that the leaders are going to be unfair in order to benefit their own people. That doesn't go over too well in America. Now, in contrast, in Latin America, we also start off with the charismatic value-based leadership, but here we've got the team-oriented leadership and the self-protective leadership. Kind of the emphasis on the in-group is really important. Participative leadership, humane-oriented leadership are medium, and this autonomous leadership is really low. And then as a final example, let's look at Confucian Asia, which is very different than the Anglo-American system. The highest ones were the self-protective leadership and the team-oriented leadership. The idea that you'll have leaders that will really protect you and take care of you and work closely with you. The humane-oriented leadership and the charismatic value leadership were in the medium level. And then the autonomous leadership and the participative leadership, leaders are going to get you involved in leadership decisions, was really quite low. So this is an introduction to the chapter, and you can read about things more in detail. It's a fascinating topic, and those of you who are bicultural or even tricultural, you know how complex this issue can be. And so this is a summary and an introduction to culture and leadership.